The more I go about my day-to-day activities, just like you, just like everybody else, the more I'm beginning to read, speculate, and view certain metaphorical examples that are specifically used within the English language by the mainstream media to refer to some type of transcendence. I'll give you a very quick example. When we take a look at Alexei Navalny, who was recently poisoned and then returned to Russia by his own will, who was then arrested upon arriving, what we'll see is a New York Times report talks about how his physical body is there, but mentally he's still free. And I say that with air quotes because I'm just quoting them, but what I want to point out here is that ultimately there's been this resurgence, or insurgence rather, of spiritual derivative perspectives, if you will, that tend to show a certain transitional state of mind and frequency, if you will. And what I'm trying to say here is that it's almost as if it's been encoded within the mainstream media and within the journalists and those who are trying to broadcast these messages to us, that there's some type of transcendence occurring. Whether that is for better or worse is hard to say, because the word transcendence is very limited. It always has a positive connotation to it. But again, we got to look at all the angles. Now, before I do that, I want to address two very quick things. First off, I want to give a shout out to Spencer Linick. Great guy, fantastic guy, big fan of the show. Spencer, I'd like to thank you so much for watching, brother. Best wishes to you and the family. Now, the next thing I want to cover very quickly is that YouTube recently demonetized and age restricted and pretty much shut down one of my videos, the Veritas video, where I talk about false flags and biorhythms and all that. And I want to mention very quickly, ironically enough, and you'll see it if you follow me on Instagram, you'll see my story, but ironically enough, the one video where I discuss thinking freely and the freedom of thought, and I don't actually discuss one specific conspiracy in particular, is the one video that YouTube said their team had personally reviewed and then all of a sudden decided to restrict it as much as possible. Now, I don't know, guys, if my channel is showing up in the recommended section or not. That might be part of their demonetization thing, so I just want to let you know that we'll probably be doing some more live streams and super chats very soon, just so I can generate some revenue to start up a website with a database for videos where I can truly speak and talk freely. So anyways, let's move on now. Project G.H.O.S.T. This is super interesting. So G.H.O.S.T, let me just get right into it now. G.H.O.S.T stands for greater harvesting of symbiotic tissues. Now, I have to be very careful with the things I'm going to say in this episode because I don't want to come across as someone trying to spread a current conspiracy theory that starts with the letter Q. So I just want to be very specific about that. However, when we take a look at, for example, let's start with very simple, WikiLeaks. Secret Space Program astronaut and former NASA astronaut Edgar Mitchell, all right, was talking with John Podesta on the space race. I've covered this before and how things are heating up. But what's very interesting is that he talked about EBE interactions and how on their Skype call they were going to discuss certain things pertaining to the secret space program. Now, here's what's very interesting. When we look at what the Archons are, we have to understand that the Archons, according to Wikipedia, are in Gnosticism and religions closely related, the builders of the physical universe. Among the Archonites, Ophites, Sethians, and in the writings of Nag Hammadi Library, the Archons are rulers, each related to one of 7 planets. They prevent souls from leaving the material realm, end quote. Now, notice how that ties back to what I just mentioned at the very beginning of the episode. It's kind of a suppression of keeping our souls, whether that is a scientific sense, and I'll get to that shortly, or a spiritual sense or perspective, keeping our souls within the same cycle over and over and over again. The idea is that after the physical body dies, and this is not according to any one specific religion, but after the physical body dies, what happens is that the soul transcends, or you have a choice of reincarnating, or many things like this. Now, I'm not saying I know the answer, but these are one of the many accepted proposals or theories, if you will. But what if there is a system in place to weaken Earth's grid, which I did an episode on last week, but at the same time to create a non-linear cyclical suppression or form of oppression of our souls? Now you might say, Dave, what is the soul really, right? Now look, I'm going to tell you straight, I don't have the exact answer, but I think we're getting close, and it has to do, believe it or not, with horseshoe crab blood. And I know that sounds crazy, but just bear with me here. So if we take a look at horseshoe crab blood, they actually have blue blood, which is related to a Blue Brains episode that I'll be coming out with shortly. But the blue crab blood has Archon DNA within it that has been studied and found by New York Times journalist. I believe her name is Linda Moulton Howe, who's been known to discuss very controversial things. Now, she was a former New York Times journalist and investigative reporter, and also an award-winning journalist. So I'd like to see them discredit her on this one. But anyways, the whole thing with the blue blood horseshoe crab blood is that there is something within their blood that is very, very particular and unique to these horseshoe crabs, and that is the ghost particle. So the question then becomes, what is the ghost particle? Well, here it is. So according to Wikipedia, and I quote, in the terminology of quantum field theory, a ghost field, ghost particle, or gauge ghost is an unphysical state in a gauge theory. Good ghosts are virtual particles that are introduced for regularization, like Fat F. Popov ghosts, end quote. Now, the next thing I want to cover very quickly is that they have no electric or magnetic forces to capture them. That's why physicists call them ghost particles. They're sort of like neutrinos, but they're subatomic particles. They have no electric charge. And so it's very interesting here, because what I want to point out is the fact that there is something powering it, but it seems to not come from this particular dimension. Now, why are these horseshoe crabs being harvested for this blood? Okay, so their blood tends to naturally hold a more potent state of this ghost particle. However, the real reason here is that, again, we're going to tie this back to the 13 bloodlines. There is a deep integration within marriage and royal bloodlines and secret society bloodlines and, major banker bloodlines, which is that over many thousands of years, their bloodlines are more and more likely to have this Archon blood DNA within them in order to allow for some type of transcendence after they die. Now, you might say, Dave, you've done episodes before where they are able to actually transfer their consciousness from one body to another. Yes, but as of recently, my research has found that when you transfer, and when the elites transfer their consciousness from one body to another, not all of the elites, but those that are privy to this type of classified technology, what happens is it's sort of like receiving a slow version of dementia, because they have not perfected it to a T yet. So as the soul transfers from one body to another, there are certain parts of the subconscious that are lost, and this is extremely significant and vital in maintaining an overall form of consciousness on the front end. So they understand that if they're going to die, they at least want to have their soul transcend, so their consciousness is still self-aware in regards to being able to ascend and not just repeat some type of cyclical, I guess we could say, torturous metaphysical imprison that the Archons have placed within this dimension. Now, what's also interesting is that we notice more and more that the lower frequential and vibrational energies are used around the world, whether that's coming off of, frequencies and energy emitted off of plants, humans, technology, you name it. Sadly, there seems to be an overall suppression of these vibrations and frequential brains, BRANES, into a more 3D state. What happens when you put this into a more 3D state is that you become more materialistic. When you become more materialistic, you become more object-oriented. And when you become more object-oriented, what then happens is that you are only focused on the things right in front of you. Hence why maybe YouTube censored my video of all videos on free thought. You know what I mean? And so when we look at this, what we have to notice is that there are certain physical, political, I guess we could say, institutions or organizations in place that are ensuring all of this. Now, if we had mentioned this 3 or 4 years, right now, people who don't watch this think you and I are crazy, but if we had mentioned 5 years ago, for example, that there was a sex island where people were getting raped and things like that, people would have laughed. Even 2-3 years ago, then the Epstein thing happened. And then 5-10 years ago, people were talking about China harvesting DNA and organs. Everybody laughed. And look, now it's in the New York Times. I'll give you one example. This is the opinion section, granted, but China's harvesting the DNA of its people. Next article by the New York Times, not an opinion piece, and I quote, China is collecting DNA from tens of millions of men and boys, quote, using U.S. equipment, end quote. All right. And also it says here, quote, even children are pressed into giving blood samples to build a sweeping genetic database that will add to Beijing's growing surveillance capabilities, raising questions about abuse and privacy, end quote. Now, do you think these surveillance capabilities are just being sent to databases and that's it? No. They're being sent to databases that harness quantum computation, which are able to utilize the ghost particle as a I guess we could say electrical charge particle that then transcends into a higher dimension in which the Archons reside. Now, why they're keeping us suppressed, I am not sure. Could this be related to the CIA's fusion cell? Very, very possible. But here's the next thing I want to talk about. This is Planned Parenthood. Now, before you say, oh my gosh, this is, he's pushing some Fox News conspiracy, just hear me out here, guys, please. So, this is Wikipedia. Planned Parenthood 2015 undercover videos controversy. In 2015, an anti-abortion organization named the Center for Medical Progress, CMP, released several videos that had been secretly recorded. Members of the CMP posed as representatives of a biotech company in order to gain access to both meetings with abortion providers and abortion facilities. The videos showed how abortion providers made fetal tissue available to researchers, although no problems were found with the legality of the process. End quote. Here's what's interesting. Wikipedia has been forced to alter the conclusion of this, but what's very interesting is that Planned Parenthood, and for those outside of the U.S., Planned Parenthood is essentially an abortion clinic and a system within the United States, and it does other things as well for children, which is good. But again, the truth is wrapped with lies, which is why they don't want us to know about these things. So when we look, for example, at Planned Parenthood, which has been supported by both Republicans and Democrats, as much as they'll deny it, on both sides, and when both sides are in on it, you know that it's really not good. It's terrible to say because you'd think that when both sides come together, it'd be for the benefit of things, but it's not. And so when we see this, what happens here is that this is one form of a materialistic three-dimensional state of an organizational structure that essentially, I don't want to say is given up in a ritualistic form to a higher power, because I don't want to jump into that. However, it is very, very difficult for me not to say that they may in fact be the case. Now, I'm not saying they're literally kidnapping babies or harvesting certain organs of these babies and giving them up as a summoning within a certain seance or ritual. Not at all. However, I wouldn't rule that out. But at the same time, I also want to mention the fact that this is happening within a very, very low vibrational state in order to be able to allow a transcendence of this type of organ harvesting amongst children. Now, I know before you cut off of this, you might say, Dave, you're going into uncharted waters here because of what you're talking about. And look, at the end of the day, guys, if this video gets removed, then it will, because I have to discuss it. Now, what's interesting about all of this is that when we look, for example, at investigating, this is frc.org, investigating Planned Parenthood and research using aborted babies, it's very interesting to see that there are controversies surrounding this, not surrounding the abortion of babies, but what they do with the organs of the children after those that are aborted end up being killed. Right? And it's a terrible thing. It's a very terrible thing. But the idea here is to allow this type of conclusion and this type of, I guess we could say, intermarital metaphysical operation to continue. And the reason for this is because, again, going back to the horseshoe crab blood, what we'll see there is that this type of blood allows these elites to be able to transcend their soul. So if they can't at least transfer their consciousness from one body to another, the least they're going to do is make sure they break free of the chains that the Archons have imposed on us. Now, I do also want to mention, I'm not trying to say anything good nor bad about the Archons. I'm sure there are good things, but I'm also sure there are bad things. So the idea here is that, again, if we look at the book of Enoch, the Nephilims, the giants, the watchers, the fallen angels, you name it, this is all connected, the Archons. All of it is to keep us within a frequential state that is lowering more and more and more, that is all about keeping us divided. Now, let's look at this in a more realistic sense. Look at the mainstream media right now. The goal is to keep us divided, whether that's through cable television, social media, and all that. So these Archons understand that within the context of the technology available to us now, this suppression is being harnessed. Now, if they cannot control us physically, they're going to control us scientifically, spiritually, and mentally as much as they can. However, what happens when you start implementing these things like crab blood harvesting? You kind of break the chain, you kind of break the rhythm of it all a little bit, right? And so when that happens, you are then being able to kind of break free of the chains that the Archons have set, so to speak. And it's a very oppressive thing in which is being done here. But the idea is that these Archons may in fact be the higher power that, as I mentioned in yesterday's episode, certain extraterrestrial races that world governments report to are reporting to. So they may be the, I guess we could call the boss of bosses, if you will, just to try to, simplify it and bring it down. However, we cannot rule out the fact that this may in fact be some type of misinformation campaign as well. But what we cannot deny is that there is something trying to keep us in a three-dimensional state of mind here. Okay. And when we look, for example, at all of the different scenarios that are occurring, we're noticing that the more and more physical laws and physical, I guess we could say, manifestations of restrictions are put into place all around us, not just within the West, but around the world. We're going to see that it's all about being able to contain us and allowing these archons to maintain control. Now, you might say, Dave, okay, this is all fine and dandy, but give us an example. I'll give you an example. There are over 4,000 statutory laws that are extremely minor criminal federal offenses that are nonsense, in the United States at least. Now, you might say, why you're bringing this up. This is a perfect manifestation of the way in which the ghost particle, through quantum information and transferring, transcends the ability to travel multidimensionally and create an electrical charge with an electrical purpose that manifests itself into the consciousness of a human mind to impose these laws, so that these laws are such nonsensical, they're pointless, but they're there in case they ever need to, the government needs to arrest someone or take someone out or silence somebody someone who's never done a crime before. So these statutory laws are put in place in order to just allow them to find a justification to arrest people like you and me, right? So again, there's a lot to take in here, but again, I jumped right into it, and I hope that that you guys have absorbed all of this. I know it's a lot to take in, a little bit different than yesterday's episode, but again, let me know what you guys think, and please keep in mind, I urge you, the ghost particle, think of it, does not have an electrical charge, but it's there. So again, thank you so much for watching, and we will catch you guys tomorrow. Cheers.